Imagine, you dedicate your time, your knowledge, your energy for years. You arrive first, you leave last. You do more than expected, simply because you don't know any other way. And on a regular evening, you open your phone, you look at a number, and for the first time, you feel neither exhaustion nor anger, but something quiet and very specific. The feeling that there's an error in the calculation somewhere, that you solved the equation correctly, but the final answer is wrong. This isn't a crisis. This isn't weakness. This is the moment a smart person finally starts to run the numbers. I'm mad, and today, I'll tell you the story of one such person, with real numbers, with real solutions. A story after which you won't be able to look at your work the same way again. There's a moment on a Friday evening when the factory quiets down, the machines cool off, and there's only one light left in the engineering department, above the corner desk by the window. Ryan has been sitting there since 8 a.m. It's now 9:14 p.m. On his screen is the assembly drawing of a gearbox that goes to the shop floor on Monday. 9 layers of detailing, tolerances in the thousandths of an inch, 3 iterations of approvals with the manufacturing engineers. He knows this assembly by heart, like the back of his hand. Better than the back of his hand, honestly. On the desk is a mug of long, cold coffee and a sandwich he didn't eat for lunch. It's dark outside. The parking lot is empty, except for the director's Ford F-150 parked by the entrance. Mr. Henderson stayed late for a meeting with partners from Chicago. Ryan heard out of the corner of his ear. The plant landed a new contract, a big one, defense. They didn't name the figure, but based on how the suits behaved walking out of the conference room, there were a lot of zeros. Ryan saved the drawing, leaned back in his chair, and mechanically reached for his phone. He opened his banking app. Not because he expected anything special, just a payday reflex. His bi-weekly paycheck hit 2 days ago. $2,430. He stared at the number for about 4 seconds. Then he closed the app. Then he opened it again, as if the number might have changed. $2,430 net. After 9 years. After getting promoted to mid-level engineer 3 years ago. After his gearbox went into mass production on 2 lines and reduced the defect rate by 12%. It was his gearbox. The engineering manager said exactly that at the all-hands meeting. Ryan's gearbox. Everyone nodded. Then they went back to their desks. Ryan thought there would be a bonus that day. There was. $500, a one-time payout before taxes. He wasn't angry. This is important to understand. He wasn't angry. Ryan wasn't the type to get angry at work. He was the type who solved problems. An engineering mindset means you see a problem, find the root cause, figure out a solution. Emotions are noise that gets in the way of thinking. That's how his dad taught him. Also an engineer, 30 years at the same plant, just in a different department. Ryan grew up in this Rust Belt town. Went to the state engineering school because it made sense and felt right. Graduated with honors, not out of ambition, but because he didn't know how to do it any other way. Came to the plant right after graduation because this was real work. Metal, tolerances, loads, real things that actually work in real machines. Not selling air, engineering. His first 3 years he grew fast. Junior engineer, then mid-level. His manager used him as an example during performance reviews. His colleagues respected him, not because he tried to be liked, but because if Ryan said an assembly would hold, it would hold. It was a reputation built not on words, but on inches and calculations. His salary grew too. From $55,000 to $65,000, then to $75,000, then to $85,000 a year gross. It felt like progress. He bought a Honda Civic on a loan, then paid it off early because he hated hanging liabilities. He rented an apartment, wanted to buy a house but kept putting it off. First one thing, then another. Imperceptibly, putting things off became his default state. He was 36 years old, 9 years of experience. The gearbox drawing on the screen. $2,430 in his phone. And on this Friday, sitting in the empty engineering department, he asked himself, for the first time not as a complaint, not out of resentment, but as an engineering problem, a question he somehow hadn't asked in all these 9 years. Where does the difference go? Not in terms of what he spends it on. He knew what he spent it on: rent, groceries, the car, occasionally something for himself. He meant something else. He was clearly worth more to the plant than his salary. Any engineer understands this. There is cost, and there is price. He is a resource in a production system. How much does this resource actually cost? Ryan picked up a pencil, an old habit. He thought better with a pencil in hand, and wrote on the back of a printout, $85,000. He put a question mark on the right, and a question mark on the left. On the left, what he didn't know: how much the plant actually spends on him, how much his workspace, his tools, his time cost the system. On the right, what he doesn't notice: where the money between those two numbers goes. He didn't know the answer. It was a strange feeling for a man used to knowing the answers. Not unpleasant. More like finding a spot on a drawing you'd been bypassing without noticing. You stand there, look, and think, how did I miss this? Outside, a door slammed. The director's F-150 pulled out of the parking lot. Ryan watched it through the window. Mr. Henderson had been at the plant for 22 years. Started as a manufacturing engineer. Then something happened, and he stopped being an engineer and became a director. Ryan had never really thought about what exactly happened in that moment. Now he did. He turned off his monitor, grabbed his jacket, threw the sandwich in the trash by the exit. It was stale. Walked to his car across the dark parking lot, the March ice crunching under his boots by the curb. The two question marks on either side of his salary spun in his head. He didn't yet know that in 3 weeks, one random conversation would give him both numbers, and that after this conversation, he would never be able to look at his pay stub the same way again. But for now, he just drove home, down the empty road, past the plant running its third shift, past the shop floor where his gearbox would launch on Monday, past the security booth where the guard was staring at his phone and didn't even look up. The corporate mixer was on the last Friday of March. Not a party, more of a mandatory event HR called team building. They rented a banquet room at a local steakhouse, set up long tables, and brought out appetizers and a couple of hot options. Ryan went because not going would have been noticed. He sat at the edge of the table next to Gary, a senior engineer who had been at the plant since the 80s and treated corporate mixers like scheduled equipment maintenance. Unpleasant, but necessary. They barely spoke, just sat side by side like two people comfortable in silence. The loudest person in the room was the VP of sales, whom Ryan had seen maybe 3 times in 9 years, and every time the guy was in a great mood. Now he was standing at the far end of the table with a drink, telling the CFO something. Ryan wasn't listening, until he heard the phrase, billable multiplier. His engineering brain reacted automatically. A multiplier is a coefficient. Ryan involuntarily turned his head. The VP was speaking loudly, with the satisfaction of a man who just closed a major deal. The phrase was tossed between sips of bourbon, casually, as a given. The Chicago partners evaluated the engineering staff at a billable multiplier of 4-to-1 against their fully loaded cost. Standard valuation methodology for manufacturing when attracting investment. The CFO nodded, they clinked glasses, and switched to another topic. Ryan sat motionless. 4-to-1. He wasn't a finance guy, but he was an engineer who knew how to work with coefficients. a multiplier of 4 to 1 against fully loaded cost, meaning every dollar the company spent on an employee generated $4 of value for the enterprise in an investment valuation. It's not profit, it's valuation. But valuation says how much a resource is worth in the system. He pulled out his phone, opened the calculator. He knew his base salary was $85,000, and with corporate benefits, his fully loaded cost was probably around $110,000. He multiplied that by 4. $440,000. He stared at the screen. Gary asked something about the mashed potatoes next to him. Ryan didn't hear. He nodded. Gary grabbed the potatoes himself. $440,000 a year. That's how much, according to the Chicago Partners methodology, Ryan was worth as a production asset. That's how much he generated for the system. He took home about $63,000 after taxes. The difference, hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, went somewhere into the structure, into equipment depreciation, facility leases, the management apparatus, profit, taxes, reserves. Somewhere. It wasn't a complaint or a grievance. Ryan understood. A plant is a system. A system requires expenses. Expenses are justified. But for the first time, he saw a number. Not a feeling, not a guess, a number. And the number shifted his perspective. He put his phone away and tried to eat. The food was fine. The conversations around him were fine. Everything was fine, except something in his head had quietly clicked. Like when you find an error on a blueprint that was there from the very beginning. You just hadn't looked at that spot. At home that same night, he sat at his desk and kept calculating. Really calculating. The way he was used to working with technical documentation. Methodically, without panic, using sources. First, he opened his pay stub breakdown. He made $85,000 a year gross. But that wasn't what the company actually paid. He looked up the hidden costs, the labor burden. The employer had to pay on top of his base salary, their half of FICA, Social Security and Medicare, health insurance premiums, 401k match, unemployment insurance. In total, about 30% on top of his gross pay. That was another $25,500. Money that he never saw. Money paid in his name, but not to him. Total. For Ryan to gross $85,000, the plant was actually spending about $110,500 a year. That was the real cost of his position to the employer, not counting equipment, his workstation, software licenses, and department overhead. He wrote a column on a piece of paper. Value to the plant, investment valuation, $440,000. Real cost to the plant, $110,500. What he actually takes home, approximately $63,000. He stared at the 3 lines for a long time, not with outrage, with the same feeling you get looking at a part that doesn't meet tolerances. Something here required understanding. Then he calculated one more thing. Over 9 years, his salary had grown from $55,000 to $85,000. That felt like growth. But he pulled up the inflation data for those same 9 years. Cumulative inflation from 2015 to 2024 was about 32%. That meant his $55,000 in 2024 dollars was roughly $72,600. His real purchasing power had only grown by a fraction of what his title and responsibilities had. He put the pen down, stood up, walked around the room, poured some water. This wasn't a crisis. Ryan wasn't prone to crises. It was something else, a feeling he couldn't accurately name for a long time afterward. The closest word was calibration. As if for 9 years he had been working with an instrument whose zero was off, and only now saw the real scale. The system wasn't cheating him. The system operated by its own rules, transparent to those who knew them, and invisible to those who simply came in at 8 a.m. and left at 9 p.m. with gearbox blueprints. He went to bed a little after 2 a.m., lay in the dark and thought about one thing. If this is visible, if it can be calculated, it means it can be changed. There had to be someone who knew this mechanics from the inside. Not a theorist, not a blogger. A person who had been inside and come out the other side. He didn't yet know that this person would appear in 11 days. At a college buddy's birthday party. At a table by the window. With a cup of coffee and a perfectly calm voice. His college friend Steve's birthday was celebrated at home, unpretentiously. About 12 people, a cramped kitchen, good food, talking until midnight. Ryan didn't really love these kinds of evenings, not because he was antisocial, but because small talk came harder to him than technical talk. But Steve was the kind of guy you go see not for the company, but for the person himself. At the table, Ryan found himself next to a man in his mid-40s he hadn't seen before. His name was Kevin. Introduced himself briefly. Used to work in HR and corporate recruiting, now on his own as a consultant. Ryan didn't immediately grasp what on his own meant, and didn't ask. Didn't want to seem nosy. For a while they talked about nothing. The city, the regional manufacturing plants, how good tech guys are always in demand. Then Kevin asked where Ryan worked. Ryan told him. Kevin nodded, no surprise, no judgment. Took a small sip of his drink and asked quietly, as if just clarifying details. And what's your base salary, if it's not a secret? Ryan named the figure, $85,000. Kevin didn't say anything, just slightly turned his glass in his hands. Then asked, "Been there long?" 9 years, Ryan said. Kevin put his glass on the table, looked at it, then at Ryan. Said evenly, with no pity or condemnation, "I spent 8 years filling those exact roles. I know that number well. You want me to explain how it's structured?" Ryan said, "I do." Kevin didn't start with philosophy or motivational talking points. He started with specifics, like a man used to working with spreadsheets, not metaphors. "Look," he said, "when a company hires an engineer at your level, they don't think about your salary. They think about the fully loaded labor cost. That's a different number. Your $85,000 is your gross. But the employer calculates the burden on top. FICA, health insurance, 401k matching. It's about 30% on top of your gross. That's another $25,000 that gets paid for you, but not to you. Total, the plant spends about $110,000 a year for you to make your 85. Ryan nodded. He had already calculated this himself. Kevin saw that the nod wasn't just polite, it was recognition. "You already looked into it," Kevin stated. "I looked," Ryan confirmed, "but I don't understand what's next." "What's next is more interesting," Kevin said. "It's not just about taxes and benefits. It's about how pay bands work. Any mid to large company has pay grades, salary ranges for every position. You know about this?" Ryan knew roughly, heard there were tiers. Kevin explained more precisely. The pay band for a mid-level engineer in manufacturing in this region is roughly $70,000 to $90,000 gross. That means your employer can pay you up to $90,000, and that will be within the approved system without needing special executive sign-offs. You make $85,000, which means you are already near the top of the band. That means one thing. Your next real growth is only possible if you jump to the next grade, and a new grade means senior engineer or a management track. Senior engineer in your sector will bump your base by maybe $10,000 to $15,000 gross. After taxes, maybe an extra $700 or $800 a month in your pocket. Is that what you've been working toward for the last 3 years? Ryan stayed silent for a second. Probably yes, he said. Kevin didn't comment on that, just continued. Now look at the other side, he said. There's a concept, value-added labor. That's how much your work actually adds to the product. You designed a gearbox that went into mass production and reduced defects by 12%. Do you know how much that's worth in dollars to the plant? Ryan didn't know. He had never translated technical results into financial ones. Kevin took a napkin, a regular paper one, like at any birthday party, and wrote down a rough calculation. If the line produces 4,000 units a month and the defect rate was, say, 18%, that's 720 units of scrap. At an average cost of $2,000 per unit, the losses were $1,440,000 monthly. A 12 percentage point reduction in defects is 12% of total production volume. That is exactly 480 units a month that no longer end up as scrap. Multiply that by $2,000. Get the number. Ryan multiplied it in his head. $960,000 a month. Kevin moved the napkin away, said calmly, "You got a $500 one-time bonus for that. That's not an injustice, it's structure. The system is not obligated to pay you in proportion to your added value. It pays you based on your pay grade. The grade is determined by the labor market, not your specific contribution." Did you know that? Ryan answered honestly, no. Kevin nodded without judgment. Most people don't, he said, because nobody explains this mechanics on day one. They tell you, work hard and you'll get paid more. That's true, but it's an incomplete truth. You'll get paid more within your band. And the band is a ceiling you can't see because nobody put up a sign. Ryan asked, "What changes the math then?" Kevin answered without a pause. "The point of application of your labor. Right now, you are selling your time and qualifications inside someone else's pricing system. The system pays you by its rules, market rates, bands, budgets. To change the math, you either have to change your position inside the system, move to a level where you participate in profit sharing or equity, not just payroll, or create your own point of application, where you determine the price of your own qualifications." He didn't say, "Quit the plant." He didn't say, "Being an employee is a trap." He simply described the mechanics, the way you describe an electrical circuit diagram. Here's the current, here's the resistance, here are the losses. Ryan listened and stayed silent, not out of politeness, out of that state when information is dense and requires time to settle. 2 weeks after that evening, Ryan did 3 things. First, he asked HR for the official salary band for his grade. They answered after a long pause and a glance at the monitor that this information was internal. He said calmly, "I understand. I just want to understand the structure for my career planning." The pause grew longer. Then they gave him the range, $70,000 to $92,000 gross. He was at $85,000. He had $7,000 left until the ceiling. Second, he set up an LLC. He didn't quit the plant, didn't burn bridges. Just registered a single-member LLC, got an EIN, understood he'd be filing as a 1099 contractor, paying self-employment tax, but legally structuring his side income. He found his first gig through a former colleague. A small manufacturing shop in the next county asked him to review their engineering drawings before launching a line. Ryan did it over 3 evenings, billed them $1,500. He set aside 30% for taxes, leaving him with a clear $1,050 net. Third, he wrote down both numbers side by side, $2,430 and $1,050, and wrote under them 80 hours and 11 hours. He didn't yet know where this would lead in a year, but for the first time in 9 years, he looked at his labor not as a salary on a pay stub, but as a resource with a real market value, a resource whose price he now knew himself. Eric had been working at the plant for 7 years, came 2 years after Ryan, but moved up more confidently. Not because he was more talented, but because he knew how to be visible. He spoke up at technical reviews, asked the right questions at the right time, and greeted upper management by their first names without stumbling. Ryan never judged this as good or bad, just a different way of surviving in the system. Everyone has their own strategy. In early May, a rumor went around the department that Eric was being promoted to senior engineer. Ryan heard it from Gary, who heard it from Brenda, the planner, who had seen the paperwork on a desk. The factory grapevine was more accurate than corporate emails. It was officially announced on Thursday at the team meeting. The engineering manager said briefly, "Starting June 1st, Eric will be moving into the senior mechanical engineer role." Everyone gave a brief round of applause. Eric nodded with the look of a man who had waited a long time for this and finally got it. After the meeting, people congratulated him in the hallway, shook his hand, said the right words. Ryan walked up too, said, "Well deserved. Congratulations." Eric replied, "Finally. Took 7 years." Ryan went back to his desk, opened a new sheet of paper. Senior engineer. He knew this pay grade. When HR gave him the band for his position, he also asked about the adjacent levels, just to understand the structure. The band for a senior engineer in their sector, from $88,000 to $115,000 gross. Eric would most likely come in at the lower bound of the new grade. That's how the system works for internal promotions, unless there are special negotiations. Let's say $90,000 gross. That's roughly $2,560 net every 2 weeks. Ryan wrote the number down. $2,560. Eric had worked toward this for 7 years. Ryan had been at $2,430 for 9 years. The difference between them was about $130 per paycheck. He felt no gloating. He felt no pity. He felt something akin to the feeling you get when you finally verify a calculation you've already checked twice. Just confirmation. Just data. Then he calculated the next step. Eric is now a senior engineer. The next step is principal engineer or engineering manager. Getting there, another few years under good circumstances. The band for a manager in their sector started around $120,000 gross. That was the ceiling, visible to the naked eye. You could only grow further by moving into administration, not engineering. Becoming a manager, not an engineer. Ryan thought about Eric without judgment. Eric was doing everything right according to the rules of the system he was in. He was a good player in this game. The problem wasn't Eric. The problem was that the game had a hard ceiling, and this ceiling was written into the corporate budget. That same evening, Ryan opened the spreadsheet he had been keeping for the last 2 months. Since February, since that evening at Steve's birthday, he had been tracking everything, methodically, the way he kept technical logs at the plant. Every gig, every hour, every dollar. Over April and May, he had completed 4 jobs as a 1099 contractor through his LLC. The first, the documentation review for $1,500, was already done. The second, developing technical specs for a small hardware manufacturer, $2,500, 2 weeks in the evenings. The third, consulting on equipment selection for a shop floor, $1,200 for 3 meetings and a final report. The fourth, redesigning engineering drawings for a company switching parts suppliers, $3,800, 3 weeks of intense work parallel to his main job. He added up the 4 figures, $1,500 plus $2,500 plus $1,200 plus $3,800 equals $9,000 over 2 months. Setting aside roughly 30% for self-employment and income taxes, he netted about $6,300 over 2 months, or $3,150 a month on average. He hadn't quit the plant. He still got his $4,860 net a month at his main job, and added $3,150 on top of it. Total over 2 months, his real take-home income was over $8,000 a month, almost double what it was 9 years ago. But the money wasn't the main thing. The main thing was something else. He looked at the hours column. At the plant, he spent an average of 9 to 10 hours a day, including overtime. On his LLC contracts, between 8 and 15 hours a week, depending on the project. He took the total hours for 2 months and calculated his hourly rate for each channel. Plant. $4,860 net divided by roughly 180 working hours a month. $27 an hour net. Consulting. $3,150 net divided by roughly 50 hours a month. $63 an hour net. The difference was more than 2 to 1. For 1 hour of his expertise on the open market, he made more than double what he made for that same hour inside the plant's pricing system. He sat over this spreadsheet for a long time. Outside, it was a warm May evening. Neighborhood kids were playing in the yard, and the smell of barbecue drifted from a nearby backyard. An ordinary evening, only the numbers on the screen made it extraordinary. Ryan thought about Eric. Right now, Eric is probably celebrating his promotion, maybe with his wife at a restaurant, maybe with colleagues. An extra $130 a paycheck. 7 years of work, a solid reputation, speaking up at reviews, greeting the right people, for $130. Ryan didn't want Eric to know this math right now, on the day of his promotion. That would be cruel and pointless. Every person comes to their own calculations in their own time, or never does, and that's a choice too. He closed the spreadsheet, opened his email. There was a new message. A manufacturing company from another state was requesting a quote to draft engineering documents for a custom assembly. They had found him through the same colleague who gave him his first gig. The scope was serious. Ryan read the technical requirements twice, estimated the labor, wrote a reply, quoted his price. Without apologies, without caveats. Just the figure he deemed fair for his level and his timeline. Sent the email, closed the laptop, stood up, stretched, walked to the kitchen, turned on the coffee maker. He thought about Eric without bitterness and without superiority. Just 2 men with the same qualifications who ran different calculations at different times. The system wasn't to blame. The system offered its rules openly, just in fine print that very few people read. Ryan had read it. Late, 9 years in, but he read it. The coffee finished brewing. He poured a mug and walked back to his desk. It was getting dark outside. Somewhere across town, the plant was running its night shift. Someone's hands were moving metal according to his blueprints. He opened the spreadsheet again. Added a new row. June. Projected contracts. He entered the number he was aiming for. March came around again, the way it always does in this Rust Belt town, with melting ice by the curbs, a gray sky that occasionally, briefly, turns almost blue. Exactly 1 year had passed since that Friday when Ryan sat in the empty engineering department, staring at the $2,430 on his phone and holding 2 question marks in his head. He was sitting at the same desk, only the desk was now at home. In January, he had quit the plant. Without slamming the door, without writing an angry resignation letter, he just put in his 2 weeks, handed over the documentation for all his open projects, said goodbye to Gary and a few people he had something in common with beyond the front gate. The engineering manager asked where he was going. Ryan answered honestly, "Starting my own firm." The manager paused, then said, "Well, good luck." The pause between those 2 phrases was long. He looked off toward his monitor, as if something important was there, even though the screen was locked. Ryan thanked him. Walked out through the same front gate where the guard was once again staring at his phone. This time, Ryan stopped for a second and looked back. At the building, at the windows of the engineering department on the 2nd floor, at the director's parking lot. He stood there, then walked to his car. No drama, just one door closing, quietly, without a slam. Now, in March, he opened the spreadsheet and started calculating his year. Not because he needed to convince himself, just an engineer's habit. Results demand numbers, not feelings. By the way, speaking of practical habits, in my email newsletter, I break down real financial decisions. No guru nonsense and no stories about making $1 million in a month. Just an honest breakdown of how money mindsets work and why most people continue to work for their expenses instead of their future. The link is in the description. Subscribe if you want to wake up 10 years from now with the feeling that your money works for you and not the other way around. From last April to this March, he had completed 23 contracts. The first 3 months, parallel to the plant, finding his rhythm. The last 3 months, entirely on his own. The gigs varied: engineering drawings, technical audits, developing specs, consulting on equipment procurement. Several clients returned. One became a regular, a mid-sized manufacturer in the next state that now brought him in on all their new projects. He tallied all the gross receipts for the 12 months. It came out to $145,000. He subtracted his estimated taxes, expenses, and overhead, roughly leaving him with $105,000 net. He wrote this number down separately. $105,000 net for the year. For comparison, he wrote next to it, $63,000. That's what he would have netted at the plant for the same year if he had changed nothing. The difference was over $40,000, but he knew the money was only the top layer of the calculation. Beneath it was something else. He counted the hours. Over the last 3 months, working entirely for himself, his average work week was about 38 hours. At the plant, with overtime, it was a steady 50 to 55. He had bought back about 60 hours a month, almost a week and a half of full-time work. These were hours that now belonged to him. He could spend them on new clients, on upgrading his skills, or simply on not sitting in an empty office at 9:14 p.m. stressing over someone else's deadlines. The third thing he calculated, and this was the hardest to put into numbers, was his risk structure. At the plant, it felt like stability meant security. One employer, one salary, one W-2. Reliable. But over the year, he saw different mechanics. 23 clients meant 23 independent income streams. If one leaves, 22 remain. If the plant eliminates a position, everything is gone at once. He thought about what he had called stability for 9 years, and now saw that it was actually a concentration of risk, not the absence of it. One source, one contract, one guy with the authority to sign a termination notice. Kevin had once told him a phrase that Ryan jotted down in the margins of his notebook back then. Income diversification isn't greed, it's an engineering principle. Don't put all the load-bearing weight on a single pillar. Ryan reread that phrase in his notebook. Put a check mark next to it. In February, he randomly ran into Eric at the mall. They stopped, talked for about 10 minutes. Normally, no awkwardness. Eric mentioned that he had settled into his new pay grade, was adapting to the new responsibilities, and doing more admin work than he expected. He said with a slight smirk, "Thought I'd be doing more engineering, but turns out I'm just doing more approving." Ryan nodded, asked how it was overall. Eric replied, "It's fine. Stable." Stable. Ryan heard that word and thought about how differently it can sound. For Eric, it was a good word. For Ryan, a year ago, too, now he heard something else in it. Not peace, but a standstill. Not security, but a lack of momentum. But that was his own perception, and he wasn't going to force it on anyone. Eric was making his choice. It was an honest choice. They said their goodbyes. Ryan walked to his car, sat down, and stayed there for a bit. He thought about how, a year ago, he stood in that same factory parking lot at 9:14 p.m., staring at the number on his phone. The exact same qualifications, the exact same metal in his head, the same tolerances and calculations. Just a different point of application. The system hadn't changed. The plant was still running 3 shifts. Pay grades still existed. Salary bands were still locked into the corporate budgets. The labor burden was still paid on top of the gross. Everything was exactly as it was a year ago. Only now, Ryan was looking at it from the outside, not the inside. He wasn't angry at the system. The system did what it was built to do: optimize costs, retain qualified people with minimally sufficient conditions, and generate value. That was business, playing by its own rules. The rules were fair to those who knew them. Ryan learned them in his 9th year. He could have learned them earlier, if someone had explained it on day 1. No one did. Not out of malice, simply because no one was obligated to. He started his car. Outside it was March, melting ice by the curbs, a gray sky with patches of light. Exactly a year ago, he drove this same road home from the plant, holding 2 question marks on either side of his paycheck. Now he knew both numbers, and he knew what to do with the difference between them. If you are looking at your pay stub right now and feeling something similar to what Ryan felt that Friday, not anger, not resentment, but just a quiet feeling that the math doesn't add up, maybe you should start with one action. Don't quit your job, don't burn bridges, just run the numbers. Find out your pay band. Figure out your multiplier. Understand what your hour is actually worth on the open market. These numbers exist. They aren't hidden, they just aren't lying on the surface. If you watched until this point, you are no longer the person you were at the beginning of the video. You've started calculating. Write the word calculating in the comments, just so I know you're here and that something clicked. Subscribe to the channel. I don't sell quick fixes, and I don't promise you $1 million in a month. I just show the mechanics. The exact mechanics the system really doesn't want you to know.